The Normandy bocage devoured men whole. Those ancient hedgerows, thick as castle walls and twice as deadly, turned every field into a killing maze where German panzers ruled absolutely. British infantry died in predictable patterns, 12 seconds average survival time when attempting visual reconnaissance of tank positions. Then, Corporal Thomas Ridley, a gamekeeper's son from Herefordshire, broke every rule in the sniper manual. What happened next made German tank commanders abandon 18 perfectly functional panzers without firing a shot. The hedgerows of Normandy possessed a malevolence that no staff officer in London had anticipated. These weren't the tidy English hedges Thomas Ridley remembered from home, those neat boundaries marking cricket grounds and country estates. These were medieval monsters, bocage grown wild for 8 centuries, their roots sunk 3 meters deep into Norman clay, their crowns rising 4 meters high, so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the farm tracks below. Within their shadows, on the morning of 14th of June, 1944, the British Second Army was dying in mathematically predictable increments. Thomas crouched in a ditch near Tilly-sur-Seulles, his Lee Enfield cradled across his knees, watching another Churchill tank burn. The stench of diesel and flesh carried on the wind. That made 7 tanks lost today from his battalion alone. The pattern was always identical. A section would advance down a narrow farm lane, hedges towering on both sides like the walls of a natural fortress. They would proceed carefully, infantry screening ahead, every man knowing that somewhere in that impenetrable vegetation, a German Panzer IV or Tiger waited in ambush. Then the eruption. The distinctive crack of an 88mm gun, the screaming of metal, the sudden bloom of fire. The German tanks were invisible until they fired, positioned with such cunning that British crews died without ever seeing their killers. The strategic situation was deteriorating into crisis. General Montgomery had promised calm would fall within 48 hours of the landing. 10 days later, the city remained firmly in German hands, and the British advance had stalled completely in this cursed agricultural labyrinth. The bocage negated every advantage the Allies possessed. Air superiority meant nothing when aircraft couldn't see through the canopy. Artillery supremacy was useless when observers couldn't spot targets 20 meters away. Tank numbers were irrelevant when each lane became a single-file death trap, where one well-positioned Panzer could destroy a dozen Churchills without being touched. The mathematics of attrition were simple and brutal. Each day, the 7th Armored Division lost between 8 and 12 tanks to ambush. Each hedgerow junction required reconnaissance that cost, on average, 3 men's lives. The attack schedule showed 72 reconnaissance requirements per kilometer of advance. Thomas had done the arithmetic in his head. At current casualty rates, his entire battalion would be dead within 6 weeks, and they would have advanced perhaps 15 kilometers. At that rate, they would reach Berlin sometime in 1947. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ashworth stood beside the burning Churchill, his face rigid with suppressed fury. He was a cavalry officer of the old school, accustomed to warfare involving speed and maneuver, utterly unprepared for this claustrophobic nightmare where every field was a separate siege. His losses since D-Day had been catastrophic. 47 tanks destroyed, 132 men dead, another 200 wounded. His superiors demanded continued offensive action. His men deserved better than this industrial slaughter. Thomas had grown up in the golden valleys of Herefordshire, where his father served as gamekeeper on Lord Pemberton's estate. His childhood had been spent in patient observation, learning to read landscape as text. He understood how deer moved through cover, how pheasants hid in undergrowth, how every living creature betrayed its presence through subtle disturbances invisible to untrained eyes. When war came, those skills made him a natural sniper. In North Africa, he had claimed 23 confirmed kills. In Sicily, another 17. But this bocage fighting was fundamentally different. Traditional sniping involved long-range observation and patient stalking. Here, visibility extended barely 10 meters. The hedgerows made distance irrelevant. The tactical problem was geometrically simple and lethally intractable. To identify a German tank's position, a British soldier needed direct line of sight. Achieving that line of sight required exposing oneself above the hedgerow. The Germans, positioned in ambush, watched these predictable observation points with machine gun-precise discipline. A helmet appearing above the vegetation survived an average of 12 seconds before enemy fire eliminated it. Commanders sent men forward in rotation, accepting these deaths as necessary cost of intelligence gathering. 3 men died to establish one tank's position. Then the artillery would fire, often missing because the coordinates were approximate. Then more men died, confirming whether the Panzer remained or had withdrawn. The cycle repeated endlessly. On the evening of 14th of June, after watching 5 friends die, attempting to spot a single Panzer that had destroyed 2 Churchills, Thomas retreated to a ruined farmhouse that served as his section's shelter. The building had been beautiful once, solid Norman stone construction that had stood for 4 centuries before German shells reduced it to roofless walls. Thomas sat in what had been the kitchen, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, his mind circling the problem that was consuming his unit. The other men were brewing tea, that essential ritual of British military life maintained even in extremis. Sergeant William Harcourt, a Sheffield steelworker in civilian life, poured Thomas a tin mug without comment. They had fought together since North Africa, communicated in the economical language of men who trusted each other absolutely. "Can't keep losing lads like this," Harcourt said finally. "Command's calling it reconnaissance. I call it murder." Thomas sipped the tea, bitter and overboiled, and said nothing. His mind was elsewhere, examining the problem from different angles. The Germans possessed superior positioning. They could observe without exposing themselves. Traditional solutions required either accepting catastrophic casualties or developing new technology that didn't exist. But there had to be another way. Nature had solutions. Prey animals survived by not exposing themselves to predators. They used water reflections to observe riverbanks. They used shadows and indirect observation. An idea began forming, so simple that Thomas initially dismissed it as too obvious. But as he turned it over in his mind, examining it from different perspectives, he realized it might work precisely because it was simple. The German tank commanders expected direct observation. They watched the hedgerow tops with disciplined attention, knowing that British heads would eventually appear. But what if observation came from a different angle entirely? What if the observer never exposed himself at all? In his knapsack, Thomas carried personal effects from home, photographs, letters, and a small shaving mirror given by his sister before embarkation. Standard military issue, perhaps 10 centimeters square, good reflective surface. He drew it out, examined it thoughtfully. The farmhouse still had some intact beams. He could climb high, use the mirror's reflection to observe ground-level positions without ever raising his head above cover. The Germans would be watching the hedgerow tops. They wouldn't be watching for angled reflections from elevated positions behind their lines of sight. The concept was absurdly simple. Climb a tree or damaged building that provided height. Extend the mirror above cover using a stick or rifle barrel. Angle it carefully to reflect ground-level view where German tanks were positioned. The observer remained completely concealed while gaining visual intelligence that currently cost 3 lives to obtain. It violated every formal sniping doctrine Thomas had learned, but formal doctrine was producing only corpses. Sergeant Harcourt watched him examining the mirror, read his expression with the telepathy of long service. "You're thinking something daft, aren't you?" "Probably," Thomas admitted. "But daft might be better than dead." He explained the concept. Harcourt listened, initially skeptical, then increasingly interested. The idea possessed elegant simplicity. More importantly, it risked only one life, Thomas's, and that risk was minimal compared to current reconnaissance methods. "Need to test it proper," Harcourt concluded. "But if it works, Tom, you might have found something that saves a lot of lads." That night Thomas barely slept. His mind was racing through variations and refinements. Multiple mirrors could provide different angles. Systematic patterns of observation could map entire German defensive positions without alerting them to the surveillance. If he could identify Panzer locations before they fired, artillery could be pre-positioned. Infantry could avoid ambush routes. Entire tactical situations could be reversed. The next morning, against regulations and without permission, Thomas began his private war. Dawn on 15th of June arrived grey and wet, typical Norman weather that made the bocage even more oppressive. Visibility in the pre-dawn darkness extended perhaps 5 meters before the hedgerows swallowed all detail in impenetrable shadow. Thomas had been awake since 0300 hours, preparing his equipment with methodical care. Besides his personal shaving mirror, he had acquired 3 additional mirrors through quiet trades with other soldiers. One borrowed from the quartermaster's supplies in exchange for a German Luger pistol taken in Sicily, another from a military policeman who wanted Thomas's superior quality American cigarettes, a third salvaged from a destroyed bathroom in Bayeux. The 4 mirrors represented different sizes and reflective qualities. The shaving mirror was smallest but highest quality. A larger mirror, perhaps 20 centimeters across, came from the bathroom salvage, slightly cracked but still functional. The quartermaster's mirror was military-grade signaling equipment designed for heliograph communication with excellent reflective properties but awkward rectangular shape. The MP's mirror was a woman's, compact, delicate and incongruous in this masculine environment of destruction, but the reflective surface was flawless. Thomas also required mounting equipment. He had begged 12 meters of wire from the signal section, persuading them he needed it for antenna repair. He collected 4 sturdy branches from hedgerow growth, trimmed them to approximately 1 meter lengths, whittled small grooves to secure the mirrors. The branches would serve as extension poles, allowing him to position mirrors above cover without exposing himself. Simple string and tape secured the mirrors to the poles, allowing angle adjustment. His plan required altitude. Traditional sniping involved ground-level positions or modest elevation. For mirror observation, Thomas needed significant height to achieve proper angles for reflecting ground-level positions that the mirrors themselves were elevated above. He had identified his first position during yesterday's reconnaissance, a tall elm tree near the crossroads outside Tilly-sur-Seulles, approximately 8 meters high, with branches that provided excellent concealment and commanding views of 3 farm lanes where German tanks were known to operate. At 0430 hours, while his section still slept, Thomas climbed the elm. His equipment followed on a rope. The rifle, the mirrors, supplies for a day's observation. The ascent was physically demanding, made more difficult by equipment weight and the need for absolute silence. German positions were close, perhaps 200 meters distant. Any noise could bring machine gun fire that would pin him in the tree, turning his innovation into his death trap. The elm's upper branches were strong enough to support his weight, but thin enough that climbing was precarious. Thomas wedged himself into a fork where 3 major branches met, creating a reasonably stable platform. Below, the landscape spread in every direction, hedgerows dividing the terrain into irregular quadrilaterals. Morning mist lay in the hollows, slowly burning off as daylight strengthened. From this elevation, Thomas could see details invisible from ground level, slight gaps in the hedgerow growth, narrow sightlines between fields, the faint outlines of farm tracks. He began his observations systematically. First, he secured his position with rope, ensuring that if he dozed or was wounded, he wouldn't fall. Second, he established clear sight lines, identifying which directions offered useful intelligence. Third, he prepared the mirrors, selecting the military signaling mirror for initial trials because its larger size would be easier to manipulate. The technique required practice and patience. Thomas extended the mirror-mounted pole above the tree canopy, keeping his own body completely concealed below. Initially, he saw only sky reflected, then treetops, then useless ground angles. Gradually, Through minute adjustments, he learned to angle the mirror to reflect ground-level views in specific directions. The sight picture was reversed and required mental translation, but it was clear enough to identify large objects like vehicles or defensive positions. At 0547 hours, on his fourth attempt, Thomas saw a German Panzer IV. The tank sat in a concealed position behind a hedge approximately 230 meters northeast of his position. From ground level, the Panzer was completely invisible, hidden behind vegetation and positioned in a slight depression that made it effectively part of the terrain. From Thomas's elevated angle, reflected in the mirror, it was clearly visible. The distinctive shape of the turret, the long barrel of the 75mm gun, even the camouflage netting draped over the hull. Thomas felt his pulse accelerate. This was exactly what he had hoped to achieve. The German crew felt secure in their invisibility, unaware that elevated observation could penetrate their concealment. He noted the exact position, took compass bearings, estimated distance, recorded everything in his notebook with careful detail. Over the next 2 hours, Thomas systematically surveyed the surrounding area using different mirrors at different angles. He identified 3 more German tanks, 2 Panzer IVs, and what appeared to be a Tiger, the latter positioned to cover the main road junction that British forces needed to control. He also spotted machine gun nests, mortar positions, and what looked like a company-strength infantry position in a stone barn. The intelligence value was extraordinary. This information, if acted upon correctly, could save dozens of lives and destroy enemy assets that had been inflicting catastrophic casualties. But Thomas faced a problem. He had acquired this information without authorization, using improvised methods that violated standard operating procedures. Would his officers believe him? Would they act on intelligence gathered by unauthorized means? At 0930 hours, he descended the tree and reported to Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth. The colonel listened to Thomas's report with initial skepticism that gradually transformed into intense interest. The detailed positions, the precise coordinates, the thorough reconnaissance, all of it had been gathered without a single casualty, without alerting the enemy, using equipment that cost nothing. "You climbed a tree with mirrors," Ashworth said slowly, as though testing the absurdity of the statement. "And from this tree, using reflected observation, you mapped 4 German tanks that we've been searching for all week." "Yes, sir." "Corporal Ridley, that is either the most brilliant improvisation I've encountered in this entire damned campaign, or it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." Ashworth studied his map, comparing Thomas's reported positions with known German activity. The pattern matched perfectly. The locations explained recent ambushes, accounted for observation of British movements. "Sir, permission to continue these observations," Thomas requested. "I can refine the technique, train others. We could map the entire German defensive system without them knowing we're doing it." Ashworth made his decision instantly. "Permission granted. Sergeant Harcourt will assist you. You'll report directly to me. I want every German position within a kilometer mapped within 3 days. Use whatever resources you require. If this works, Corporal, you'll save more British lives than any amount of conventional heroics." That afternoon, British artillery fired on coordinates Thomas had provided. The first salvo destroyed a Panzer IV. The second collapsed a machine gun nest. The Germans scrambled to respond, assuming aerial observation had spotted them, never suspecting ground-based reconnaissance had penetrated their concealment. Over the following 5 days, Thomas refined his technique into systematic methodology. He identified 12 elevated positions around Tilly-sur-Seulles, trees, church towers, damaged farm buildings. He trained 4 other soldiers in mirror observation techniques. They worked in rotation, maintaining constant surveillance, building detailed maps of German positions. The intelligence they gathered transformed British tactical operations. Advances that previously cost 30 casualties were executed with losses of 3 or 4. German ambushes were preemptively destroyed. Enemy commanders found their carefully prepared positions struck by artillery they couldn't see. The conditions were brutal. Thomas spent 12 to 14 hours daily in exposed positions, summer heat alternating with sudden cold rain, unable to move without risk of detection. He developed cramps, suffered from dehydration, once nearly fell when a branch broke under his weight. The mental strain was equally severe, watching battles unfold from elevated positions, seeing friends die in actions he had advised on, carried psychological weight that traditional sniping did not involve. But the results were undeniable. In the week following Thomas's innovation, tank losses in his sector dropped by 70%. Infantry casualties fell by similar margins. The 7th Armored Division, previously stalled, advanced 3 kilometers, more progress than they had achieved in the previous 2 weeks. German forces in the Tilly-sur-Seulles sector began withdrawing, unable to understand how their concealed positions were being systematically destroyed. Sergeant Harcourt, observing Thomas' work, summarized it with characteristic bluntness. "You've turned invisible ghosts into visible targets, Tom. Jerry can't fight what he can't understand. That's worth more than all the tanks in Normandy." Thomas didn't feel heroic. He felt exhausted, frightened, and increasingly aware that his success would eventually prompt German countermeasures. The mirror technique worked because it was unexpected. Once the enemy understood the methodology, they would adapt. He needed to exploit this advantage as thoroughly as possible before that adaptation occurred. German military doctrine had been forged in the crucible of Eastern Front combat. Refined through 3 years of brutal warfare against Soviet forces, it emphasized aggressive reconnaissance, rapid adaptation to battlefield conditions, and ruthless exploitation of enemy weaknesses. When Lieutenant Jürgen Hessler, intelligence officer for the 12th SS Panzer Division, began compiling reports from the Tilly-sur-Seulles sector in late June 1944, he initially attributed the increasing losses to improved British artillery coordination or enhanced aerial reconnaissance. The pattern of position compromises seemed random, explicable through normal military probability. But by 28 June, the pattern had become impossible to dismiss. 19 separate defensive positions had been compromised and destroyed with uncanny precision. The British weren't searching for German positions. They knew exactly where they were. Artillery strikes arrived within 30 minutes of units taking position, suggesting real-time surveillance. Yet there had been no observed British reconnaissance patrols, no aerial activity, no visible observation posts. German counter-reconnaissance sweeps found nothing. The British intelligence appeared impossible, yet its results were lethally real. Hessler's reports documented the growing confusion in German tank units. Panzer commanders who had operated successfully for months suddenly found their positions targeted before they could fire. Company commanders shifted locations nightly, achieving no improvement in survival. The SS soldiers, accustomed to battlefield dominance, began speaking quietly of British ghost observers who could see through walls. Morale didn't collapse. These were elite troops, but confidence eroded steadily. The most disturbing incident occurred on 2nd July near the village of Saint-Pierre. Hauptmann Klaus Brandt commanded a panzer company positioned in depth defense. 8 tanks distributed across hedgerow positions, mutually supporting, impossible to outflank. His positions had been selected personally by divisional staff, occupied under cover of darkness, camouflaged with obsessive thoroughness. At those 600 hours, his forward observer reported no British movement. At 06:15 hours, British artillery began falling with devastating accuracy on positions that shouldn't have been known to anyone outside German command. Within 12 minutes, 4 panzers were destroyed. 2 more were damaged. The survivors withdrew in confusion, Brandt screaming radio demands for explanation. How had the British known? Who had betrayed the positions? The Divisional Intelligence Section launched immediate investigation, assuming espionage or signals interception. They found nothing. Radio discipline had been perfect. No civilians had observed the deployment, yet somehow the British had acquired precise targeting data. Thomas Ridley had observed the entire German deployment from a church tower 800 meters distant. Using the improved techniques he and his team had developed, employing multiple mirrors simultaneously to provide stereoscopic observation, he had mapped Brandt's entire company position within 90 minutes of their arrival. The intelligence passed directly to division artillery, who engaged the targets with devastating efficiency. From Thomas's perspective, this engagement represented the tactical evolution he had been pursuing. The Germans were adapting, becoming more cautious, but their adaptations remained conventional. They improved camouflage, changed positions more frequently, maintained stricter radio silence. What they couldn't counter was observation methodology they didn't understand. Thomas's mirror network now extended across 5 kilometers of front, 12 observation posts maintained by 8 trained operators, providing continuous real-time intelligence that transformed British tactical operations. The physical and mental demands on Thomas and his team intensified as operations expanded. They worked in 4-hour rotations to prevent exhaustion-induced mistakes. Each observer carried standardized equipment, 2 mirrors of different sizes, mounting poles, signal flags for communication when radio silence was required, detailed maps, binoculars, compasses. The work required extraordinary patience and concentration. Hours of immobility in exposed positions, summer heat reaching temperatures that made metal equipment painfully hot to touch, ever-present fear of German detection. The relationship dynamics within the team developed its own culture. Thomas led through example rather than rank, personally taking the most dangerous observation positions. Private Daniel Murphy, a Liverpool dock worker, proved naturally talented at mirror manipulation, his hands steady enough to maintain angles for hours without drift. Lance Corporal James Thornton, a Birmingham schoolteacher, possessed photographic memory that allowed him to map complex positions without constant notebook reference. Together, they formed an efficient reconnaissance cell that produced intelligence quality unprecedented in the Bocage campaign. On 5th July, Thomas observed something that changed the entire operational situation. A German Panzer commander, responding to the inexplicable British intelligence advantage, made a decision driven by desperation rather than tactics. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Mannheim, commanding a battle group of 12 Panthers, ordered his tanks to abandon their prepared positions and withdraw 3 kilometers to the rear. The withdrawal occurred without combat contact, without British pressure, driven purely by Mannheim's recognition that remaining in place meant certain destruction by artillery strikes he couldn't understand or counter. Thomas watched through his mirrors as the Panthers retreated. He reported the withdrawal immediately. British forces advanced unopposed into positions that should have required days of costly fighting. Mannheim's decision, perfectly rational from his perspective, had resulted in strategic German defeat without battle. The implications were profound. If German commanders believed their positions were inherently compromised, they would continue withdrawing rather than accepting destruction. The mirror reconnaissance was achieving effects beyond simple tactical intelligence. It was destroying German confidence in defensive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, reviewing the St. Pierre operation results, summarized the strategic implications with grim satisfaction. The enemy doesn't know what's happening to them. That's worth more than numerical superiority. Fear of the unknown is more destructive than any weapon we possess. But Thomas understood the clock was ticking. Eventually, German intelligence would identify the mirror observation methodology. They would develop countermeasures, perhaps begin their own elevated reconnaissance. The current advantage was temporary, a window of opportunity that would close as the enemy adapted. The question was whether that window would remain open long enough to achieve the breakthrough that could end the Bocage stalemate. On 8th of July, during a routine observation from his elm tree position, Thomas noticed movement that made his blood freeze. A German soldier, perhaps 200 meters distant, was also climbing a tree. The soldier carried what appeared to be binoculars and a signal flag. The Germans were learning. They were beginning to understand that elevation provided intelligence advantages that ground-level observation could not achieve. Thomas marked the position carefully, reported it immediately. That evening, a British sniper team eliminated the German observer before he could report his findings. But the incident confirmed what Thomas had feared. The window was closing. The Germans were adapting. The mirror technique had perhaps another 2 weeks of effectiveness before enemy countermeasures neutralized the advantage. Sergeant Harcourt, hearing Thomas's assessment, poured them both tea in the evening quiet. 2 weeks, Tom. That's 2 weeks of lads going home instead of dying in these bloody hedges. 2 weeks of Jerry wondering what the devil's happening. You've done something remarkable. Don't diminish it by worrying about when it ends. Thomas sipped his tea, tasting the familiar bitterness, feeling the exhaustion of 10 days' continuous operations settling into his bones. Harcourt was right. Every day the mirror reconnaissance remained effective meant British soldiers survived who would otherwise have died. That was all that mattered. Not glory, not recognition, simply the arithmetic of lives saved through innovation born of desperate necessity. The Battle of Normandy ground forward through July and August 1944 with relentless, terrible momentum. The Bocage country that had seemed impenetrable in mid-June gradually yielded to British pressure, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through cumulative attrition. German forces, their tactical excellence unable to compensate for numerical inferiority and complete Allied air dominance, withdrew gradually toward the Seine. By late August, the Normandy campaign was effectively concluded. Having cost both sides casualties measured in the hundreds of thousands, the Germans had fought brilliantly but lost conclusively. Thomas Ridley's mirror reconnaissance had played its small but significant part in that larger victory. Over 42 days of operations from mid-June to late July, his team had provided intelligence that directly resulted in the destruction of 31 German tanks, 74 defensive positions, and 8 artillery batteries. More significantly, the intelligence had enabled British attacks that achieved objectives with casualties averaging 40% lower than operations conducted without mirror reconnaissance support. The statistical analysis, compiled by division staff, estimated that Thomas's innovation had saved between 200 and 300 British lives, soldiers who went home to their families rather than dying in Norman hedgerows. The technique's effectiveness declined steadily after mid-July as German forces adapted their tactics. They began conducting more frequent position changes, employed more sophisticated camouflage that defeated mirror observation at longer ranges, and increased their own elevated observation efforts. By early August, the mirror reconnaissance provided diminishing returns as both sides' tactics evolved. The window of asymmetric advantage had closed, as Thomas had predicted, but during its brief operation, it had materially influenced the battle's outcome. On 14th of August, Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth summoned Thomas to battalion headquarters, now established in a commandeered chateau near Falaise. The colonel looked exhausted, having aged visibly during 2 months of continuous operations. But satisfaction showed in his expression, the satisfaction of a commander who had led his men with competence and seen them survive in numbers that might otherwise have died. "Sit down, Corporal," Ashworth said, pouring 2 glasses of liberated French wine. "Or should I say Sergeant Ridley? Your promotion came through this morning." Thomas accepted the wine, but felt uncomfortable with the promotion. He had done what seemed necessary with tools available. Others had shown equal innovation, equal courage. The British Army's success in Normandy reflected collective determination, not individual heroics. Ashworth read his discomfort accurately. "You're thinking you don't deserve recognition. That's wrong. What you did was precisely what Britain requires from her soldiers: practical innovation under pressure. You identified a problem that was killing your mates, developed a solution using available resources, and implemented it despite skepticism and bureaucratic obstacles. That's the definition of exemplary service. The colonel spread a map on his desk, marked with symbols indicating mirror observation posts. 31 tanks destroyed. 273 lives saved by conservative estimate. Strategic intelligence that enabled an entire division to advance 3 weeks ahead of schedule. That's your achievement, Thomas. Don't diminish it through false modesty. Thomas sipped the wine, which was excellent, probably looted from the chateau's cellars. Will the technique be documented, sir? Taught to others? It worked here. Might work elsewhere. Already being written into field training doctrine, Ashworth confirmed. Your methods will be taught at infantry school, incorporated into reconnaissance training. Every sniper section will be instructed in elevated mirror observation. You've contributed something that will save lives in future conflicts, not just this one. The larger war continued beyond Normandy. Paris was liberated on 25th August. Allied forces drove toward Belgium and Holland. Thomas's battalion followed, participating in operations that seemed anticlimactic after the Normandy intensity. The mirror reconnaissance techniques he had developed saw occasional use in subsequent fighting, but never again with the same dramatic effectiveness. The Normandy bocage had provided unique conditions where the innovation achieved maximum impact. In different terrain, facing different tactical situations, other solutions proved more effective. Thomas survived the war, returning to Britain in June 1945 after VE Day. He went home to Herefordshire, resumed work as gamekeeper on Lord Pemberton's estate, married his childhood sweetheart, raised 3 children. He spoke rarely of his wartime experiences, maintaining the characteristic British reticence about military service. When pressed by his children for war stories, he would describe the mirror technique with self-deprecating humor, making it sound like simple improvisation rather than tactical innovation. In 1976, a military historian researching reconnaissance operations in Normandy discovered references to mirror observation techniques in archived after-action reports. Intrigued, he traced the innovation to Thomas Ridley and interviewed him extensively. Thomas, by then 68 years old and retired, described the technique's development with precise detail. The historian published his findings in a specialist military journal, crediting Thomas with significant tactical innovation. The publication attracted no public attention, but was read carefully by military professionals interested in improvised reconnaissance methods. The deeper legacy of Thomas's innovation extended beyond tactical methodology. It represented something fundamental about British military culture during the Second World War, the capacity for practical improvisation when orthodox methods failed. The British Army of 1944 was not the most technologically advanced force, not the largest, not the best equipped, but it possessed a culture that valued initiative, rewarded practical problem-solving, and trusted junior ranks to develop solutions to tactical problems. Thomas's mirror technique emerged from that culture, succeeded because of that culture, and contributed to victory precisely because British military doctrine allowed space for such innovations. The philosophical implications resonated beyond military contexts. Thomas had faced a problem that appeared insoluble within conventional frameworks. Orthodox reconnaissance methods cost catastrophic casualties. Technology to solve the problem didn't exist. Resources were scarce. Yet by thinking laterally, by reconsidering fundamental assumptions about how observation must be conducted, he had found solution hiding in plain sight. The mirrors were simple, the technique was simple, but simplicity didn't diminish effectiveness. Sometimes, the most profound innovations came not through technological advancement, but through asking different questions. In May 1994, Thomas attended a D-Day 50th anniversary ceremony in Portsmouth. He was 76 years old, his health declining, but his mind remained sharp. During the ceremony, a young soldier approached him, having recognized his name from training materials. The soldier explained that mirror reconnaissance techniques were still being taught, still considered relevant for certain tactical situations. Thomas's innovation, 50 years after Normandy, remained part of British military doctrine. Thomas felt profound satisfaction hearing this. Not pride exactly, that wasn't quite the right word, rather a sense of completion. What he had done in those desperate June days when his friends were dying in the hedgerows had mattered beyond the immediate moment. It had contributed to victory, saved lives then and since, and become part of the institutional knowledge that soldiers studied. That was enough. That was more than enough. He died in 1998 at the age of 80, surrounded by family, his passing noted in local newspapers with respectful obituaries mentioning his wartime service. The obituaries briefly referenced his reconnaissance innovations, but most readers skipped past those details, unaware of their significance. Thomas would have appreciated the modesty of that recognition. He had never sought glory, had never considered himself heroic. He had simply done what seemed necessary when friends needed saving and orthodox methods were failing. The British military quietly maintains Thomas Ridley's story in training materials, teaching new soldiers about his innovation. The mirror technique itself is largely obsolete in an era of thermal imaging and drone reconnaissance, but the underlying lesson remains profoundly relevant. When conventional approaches fail, lateral thinking and practical improvisation can achieve results that technology and resources cannot. That lesson, forged in Normandy hedgerows during humanity's darkest conflict, remains eternal. Thomas Ridley's ingenuity saved hundreds of lives using nothing more than mirrors and determination. Proof that British resolve can overcome any obstacle. If you found this story of wartime innovation compelling, subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts of extraordinary courage from the Second World War. What other forgotten heroes deserve recognition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement keeps these vital histories alive for future generations.